Like I said, this chapter is called Studying Contemporary Culture. I love the new PowerPoint. I don't know if you've had occasion to use the new Microsoft PowerPoint, but they suggest little things that you can put up there sometimes. And here they give me this little world with the America. It's pretty nice of them. You know, just threw it in there. I don't even have to look for it. So sometimes they do good things for me when they don't even charge me for it, I guess. So there's another one. Talks of what it was, which is what happened when I put in this word, the lens of culture. Felicia, start us off. Why is culture a lens? Actually, that's too much. What is culture? What did you get out of it? As opposed to what did you start us off with? What do you like about this first part?
I was just talking about an inference and cultural lens, like how an inference will learn. An inference from a Ghanaian culture will learn a Ghanaian culture, or if you want someone else in Ghana, you want to learn Ghana.
Okay, great. Yes, very important. Threw you there for a second. The lens of culture. Maybe you're thrown by this image because PowerPoint gave me a camera lens, when really we're talking about something more like a contact lens, something you don't even see, but you look through the world and the world looks different because of it, because of the way we learn to apprehend the world. And as Felicia told us, it's very important that it seems perhaps almost way basic to us in today's day and age that we learn the culture or cultural stuff that we grow up in. So if you're Ghanaian and are born in Ghana, you will probably learn Ghanaian culture. But as Gonzalez says, if you are an infant born to an Italian mother and a Polish father living in Ghana, will also learn Ghanaian culture. Now, again, this seems obvious, maybe, hopefully, to us today, but in the old days, it wasn't necessarily so obvious. Maybe in Intro to Anthropology, I told you about my great-grandfather, and my nephew was adopted at about 3 months of age from South Korea. And as the infant was my nephew was crawling around eventually on the floor, a puzzled look came over my great-grandfather's face, and he said, "Now, wait a second. When that kid starts to talk, is he going to start talking in English or in Korean?" So, yeah, in fact, English. Now, of course, we know that language learning starts at a very early age, even before we can talk. And so there's probably he was probably primed if he would have continued down the road in Korea, he would have been primed to do that. We actually get our auditory faculties if they're going to develop very early on. And so we prefer our native languages from a very early age. But we all know now that, of course, came completely fluent or started off as completely in American English and has almost no cultural stuff from South Korea. So again, this is to us a pretty basic point, but in the old days, people wondered if culture or our behavior, our thoughts, our ideas were in some ways transmitted by a different means here. So Gonzalez then goes on to talk about the parts of culture. Again, pretty basic, but I want to pause here because it's important to understand these things as they work together and as anthropologists see them as a larger whole. So what we think, our ideas, our ideology, our view on the world, a lot of people kind of want to stop here when it comes to culture. A lot of people, when we say culture, think about religion or different idea systems that people have. But it's important that for anthropologists, what we think is also, or one other part of culture is what we do, our behavior. And I've drawn some little arrows in there because some of us think about what we do, some of us do things and then we think about it. It's, it's all part of a process. And culture also involves behavior. Sometimes we say or believe we're doing one kind of thing, but we're actually doing something else. So coming up with that match or that mismatch between our ideas about what we're doing and what we're doing is actually an important part of anthropological fieldwork. What people say they're doing, what people say they're doing, and what they are doing. And then what we have. And here again, I've drawn this as kind of a relationship. One of the things that we do, one of our activities in the world, our primary activities, is not just to think, but to make stuff, to make things, to produce things for ourselves or for other people. And so those turn into the things that we have, or in the case of food, the things that we probably consume rather quickly. And what we have, what we might call our material culture, or our production, also will influence what we think. So that as this becomes a kind of a feedback loop. So if we grow up in a certain society in which we've produced a bunch of chairs, and you're always sitting in a chair, then your body will become accustomed to sitting in a chair, and you will lose the other human ability, which is to squat for long periods of time and not need chairs. And so that becomes a part of your developing body and influences how you think about the world and how the next generation is going to think about the world. So for anthropologists, these are all a part of culture, and we don't want to just put culture in one of the boxes, limit it to the things we think without thinking about like what people have and what might be the difference between having a lot of stuff in a society and not having anything at all. Or inequality in a society is also a part of the cultural framework. And we want to, again, simple stuff, but we want to make sure we include all of it. Oops, I want to, yeah, there we go. So perhaps most importantly about culture is that the things we think, the things we do, and the things we have are not determined by biology or the natural world out there. So, well, Juliana, where do we get these things? Where do we get the things we have, with things we do, and the things we think? Yeah, crucial. It's learned. So this is something that we are learning all the time. We're growing up, growing into. We learn it. One of the most crucial parts of culture. Zolas also tells us that it's associated with symbols. Seth, what is a symbol?
Well, a symbol can be multiple different things. One of the examples that the book gave, which I never really thought about, was just like words in general, whether it's like speaking or like reading them. The one example they gave is like if you're reading in English and you see an S at the end of something, you know that it is now like, or like there's multiple of those things. So like, yeah, but it just means something more than just what it is.
Okay, yeah. I mean, the classic example, like you said, is that of language, in which we're using all these sounds and all these words to mean all kinds of different things that might not be present, that we might not be able to see. The sounds that we use for different words don't have anything to do with what's actually there. Associations between, as you described, between the letter S can then mean plurality if you're a speaker of US English, whereas in other societies it doesn't mean anything at all. And obviously, again, the classic example is language, but we do this with all sorts of stuff like flags and if you're waving a white flag and what that's supposed to mean. And some people believe that humans are kind of overbuilt for symbolic communications. We're always seeing symbolic stuff, even where it's not technically there. And that's why we look up at the stars and we see different shapes, or somebody has a piece of toast and all of a sudden Jesus is in the toast. You never know. But we see faces, we see things, we associate the world, we interpret the world in a symbolic way, and that enables us to pass things along in terms of culture. Now, you asked a question there, Seth, which is about this example of the earrings and Mr. West, and if you're going to hang some weird earring off your ear, is that a culture? How far does it go? And I have to say, with no disrespect to Mr. West, that, things have to be a little bit more shared. If they're just a fad, then, they're a fad. We know what fads are. But over time, to be considered, I think, part of our cultural repertoire, it has to be more widely shared and more widely talked about than simply being a fashion fad or something, a quirk or something an individual is doing. So, it's always debatable how far things are shared. Some anthropologists like to say that things are shared and contested, that there's something interesting going on in a culture when people are arguing about it. They may not all get along, but they agree that this is something that shared arguments in some ways are important to a culture. And this relates to the shared part that Gonzalez described it as holistic. I like to think of it more as interconnected, that different stuff in a culture affects different parts of the society. So if your religious changes can lead to economic changes and vice versa, so that every part of a culture is going to be connected to a different part. So we can think about this as being holistic. The reason I'm kind of shying away from the word holistic is because it implies that every culture is its own encased whole. And I don't think that's really the best way to think about culture, but I do like to think about it as interconnected. So these are some of the ways in which that we can think about how culture works. Now, crucially, like we were talking about last week, and in some ways what we'll be talking about next week, the ideas of anthropology were used to fight against ideas of ethnocentrism. Let me pause for a second here. Francis, I think you talked about ethnocentrism. Am I correct? What is ethnocentrism? Okay, so that your way is the only way, the correct way, the right way to do things, and that other people are wrong or disgusting or backward, or all the ways in which we talk about other people. And you made a mention of something, very delicious dish, which I've had a few times in my life. Not enough. It tastes like chicken. Hmm? This is kui. It is if it is well done, well roasted, hot. It's got to be a hot fire. Get that skin crisp. It is quite tasty. I think chicken. I would more closely associate with rabbit if you've had rabbit, but in Ecuador or aquí? They do raise cuy for Ecuadorian consumption in Pennsylvania. You can get them in certain restaurants in Queens, but you might have to ask special for them. This is one of the primary proteins of the Inca Empire, and so it actually extends basically where the Incas were is where cuy production and stuff goes. Don't they even in Ecuador? Yo también, yo estuve en Quito un año cuando era 20 años. Yeah. So the place where I did field work was in Colombia, in southwestern Colombia. And interestingly, ethnocentrism doesn't always apply for like one society to another. It can apply within a society as well. So in most of Ecuador, people, I think, eat cuy, but in Colombia, only the people where I was in the southeastern corner of it ate cuy. And if you went north, then people didn't anymore, and they would look down on people there and think they were bad. So it actually can apply within a society as well. But the chicken part, oh yes, I'll do one fieldwork story. So when I first brought my wife to the field, we had recently been married, and we were on this terribly long bus trip from Quito. You have to go north, and you're driving for like 7 hours and through all these checkpoints and places. And of course, I'd forgotten to take any food, so we're just like starving. We get to the family where we were living, where I was living, and they bring out all this food, and there's rice and there's stuff, and there's this meat on top of the rice and the potatoes, and we're just hungry and we're eating it up, eating. We go back into, we get done with the meal. My wife's like, did I just eat cuy? Was that guinea pig? I'm like, no, that was chicken. And the thing is, it was a part of the chicken. It was like the neck of the chicken, which we usually don't eat in this country. And so she'd never had the neck of the chicken, but if you cut it up and cook it right, it can be good too. So that's, if it tastes like chicken, it might just be chicken. All right, wait a second. Where'd we go? That was very exciting. But Francis, you asked a question, which is ethnocentrism really going away? What made you ask that question? You don't think it's going away. Brady, you don't think it's going away either. Why not? You were talking about the world. It sounded terrible out there. Yeah. It's getting scared.
There's too many people. Right, open to other people's opinions or cultures, or there's not enough open-mindedness to at least accept something else that might be different.
Now we have two no's. We're on two no. Ethnocentrism is not going away so far. Anybody want to argue that it's going away? So you're saying that we might be around each other more, but it's not making it better. So you're still a no. Uh-oh, Seth.
I would say, Anthony, I think it just makes more people sheltered in their own opinions. Because I'm learning about this in psychology too. The more you fight against, the more someone fights against your beliefs, the more you're going to stand in your own belief, whether it may be wrong or not. But that's just how we are built as humans. Like, if someone tells us we're wrong and tries giving us proof, we're going to double back on our own opinion. So I think that's being shown by some people.
Huh. We got 4 no's, basically. Nobody's going to argue that ethnocentrism's going away. Wow. I was all prepared to argue against your idea that it was going away, and now you're all telling me that it's not going away, and I'm going to have to argue that it is. That's going to be tough for me to do. I have to think about that one. Huh. You sure nobody wants to say it's gone away? Huh? That'll be fun. Huh. Are you more ethnocentric than you were before? Well, Seth just told me that the more your views are challenged, the more you're going to double back on them. So are you saying that as you've come to college, now that you have a queen in front of your face, you are now becoming more ethnocentric by the more I put this thing up there, the worse it's going to get? The more I put this up there, the hungrier you're going to get, and you're going to try it out. I found this picture. It's a pretty good one, I think. It's one of my better pictures. Yeah, yeah. Now this is just, you can just get this on good old Google. Yeah, Google's bringing the world in. PowerPoint did not bring this to me. They do not know what this is. I didn't put in Qui, though. I put in ethnocentrism. They might bring it. I don't know. I have my doubts about that. No, PowerPoint speaks too many languages. Well, I guess I actually do want to talk about the sort of waxing and waning of ethnocentrism. I would say I've been doing this for a while, and I guess I would say that if I had asked you this question in the year 2000, I think most of the class would say that ethnocentrism was going away. I'll just put that one out for you. That it's changed over the years. I think 22 years ago, people did believe that everybody was just getting, that as the world was coming together, globalization, that things were going to get more easygoing and people would talk to each other, and these differences of religion and race and ethnicity were going to fade out. And there are all these movies about people, you know, the fall of communism and going around and talking to different people. And the idea was, now that we can communicate with each other, things are going to be nicer. Yeah, it didn't work out, did it? Right. So as we know, this weekend will be the 23rd. What year is this? 21st anniversary of September 11th, which kind of revved up the ethnocentrism again. All right. Yeah, just a little. Okay. Well, that should be fun. So what anthropology was supposed to propose is the idea of cultural relativism. So instead of being ethnocentric, we would become more engaged in cultural relativity. Go back to Brady. What does that mean, Brady? How are we supposed to look at other societies?
If you're offered to read a book and you try it and try and understand why they would enjoy something like that.
All right, try and understand within its own context. So the idea of cultural relativism is that since we all grow up with a culture or cultures and it's learned, we can also learn to appreciate the ideas of others in their own context. Doesn't mean we're even going to like Qui. We might not, but we can try it. We can see how it is before we judge it. Right. So that would be the idea of cultural relativism. And in my view, it's best seen as something that is fighting against ethnocentrism, where it gets into some kind of trouble, and where I see some of the limits of cultural relativism is, does that then mean, as Gonzalez writes, that every culture is valid and complex? Or that, as she puts it on page 33, cultures are equally valid? And here I think that I don't want to confuse cultural relativism with what I would consider philosophical relativism or moral relativism, which would be the idea that kind of anything is valid in its own context and anything goes, I guess, would be the extreme of that. So for me, I like to see it as a way that we understand that we can try things, but we don't necessarily have to approve of them. And I think Gonzalez also wants to be careful with this too, because she begins to talk about cultural adaptation and maladaptation. And this is the idea that there are some things that are good for our health and our well-being, and there are things that might, even though they're long-standing cultural traditions, are maladaptive. She uses one of the classic examples of this that people often see as a conflict between cultural relativism and perhaps the idea of human rights, which is that of female genital cutting and what that does to the health of women, even though it may be an accepted cultural practice. So, I mean, I think this is an important idea, an important point, that some things might be maladaptive and adaptive. But I would caution that it's very difficult to measure adaptiveness and maladaptiveness. And maybe that's why PowerPoint did give me this peacock, because just like in biological traits, being well adapted depends upon the environment, and in an ever-changing environment, what was once adaptive in one environment is maladaptive in another environment. And so the peacock's tail is not a very adaptive thing for like survival, not good. But it is adaptive for the male peacock if it's trying to get a mate, very showy. So I think whenever we think about adaptive or maladaptive, one of the things we have to ask is, well, who's it maladaptive for? And oftentimes when we're looking at another society or at our own, things that might seem maladaptive might seem mighty adaptive to certain parts of the society who are getting something out of it. Also, want to speculate a little bit, if we turn this lens of maladaptive onto our own society or onto US society, what kinds of things do you think outsiders would say about US culture that they would say, that's maladaptive, guys. What are you doing that for? Why don't you just stop? You're hurting yourselves. Sure. The food portions that we eat. Maladaptive, using too many resources, too many cows, maladaptive. Why don't you just stop? Why don't you just cut back? Tone it down, guys. Can't you deal? You need that much steak. We might. Food. Huh. What else? You were an outsider to the US and you were looking at our society. What would people say? What are you guys doing that for? That's dumb, Cyrus.
People go to college for whatever reason, that student debt for the rest of their life. Lived in China for 12 years, and people like there didn't think it was something you could do.
Maladaptive to spend that much money and go into debt just to be here with me? That sounds crazy, man. Too much money. And I mean, yeah, you can see it as like from that perspective, or many European countries, education is completely free through college. They think that it was nuts to have all this college debt. Why would you go into debt? Just free, as long as you're pass the test. Huh, interesting. Francis. Huh. Why is healthcare so expensive? Yeah, that seems kind of maladaptive if you want your society to be of good health. Of course, we don't care if our society is of good health, as we've been proving the last few years. Yeah, yeah, we're not that into health. So that was yours, healthcare. Anything else? Soccer. I'll pick on my soccer player. Come on, Nick. Why should we have soccer? It's dangerous. All those concussions, man. What good has it done anybody?
Yeah, but you could get a concussion for all of them. Rugby's even worse. Yeah.
Rugby's worse? All right. Well, okay. I won't pick on soccer then. How about the intercollegiate athletic complex, though? You know, all the money we spend on. Maybe we don't. We're okay. We've been downgrading our money over time. Some people came here for football, or I mean soccer. And we went to Division III. I didn't want to talk. Well, I wanted somebody to mention this one. Gun violence. Maybe too obvious. All right. But I think Nick has made an important point that, I mean, whenever we're looking at adaptive and maladaptive, some people might be gaining from it and some people might like that. So we have to always be careful here. Actually, it's very difficult to measure. It's very difficult to come up with an absolute measure. And that's why I prefer to think that we don't think of culture as equally valid and instead think of cultural relativism as a way to explore different ways in which we think about the world without necessarily accepting any part of another person's or our own society. It sometimes helps if we understand culture not to be a place in which everybody is the same. What do we know about societies and cultures, Nikki? What are they like? Okay. Yeah. I like to say it kind of this way, that all societies, all cultures, all groups are going to have variation. The bigger word for that we use is that societies are heterogeneous. They're not all the same. There's going to be maybe different subgroups, different what we might call subcultures, different opinions, different ideas within a society. Now, Gonzalez contrasts that with being homogeneous, a culture that is homogeneous, that shares a lot of things. But for me, I would caution you that it's difficult to measure what makes a culture homogeneous or heterogeneous. In part because of some terms that she introduces, the difference between edict, or a viewpoint from the outside, and emic, or a viewpoint from the inside. So sometimes from outside a culture, we might say, "Ah, very homogeneous, they're all the same." But for the insiders, they might be like, "Oh no, we're way different from each other." Or it could be the opposite. We might be outside the society and think that things are way different, and the insiders insist that they're all the same. So a lot of this is, again, there's not really an objective measure of homogeneity and heterogeneity. And just a couple examples. Swedish and Norwegian, which I don't speak, but I understand that they're actually, from an outsider perspective, pretty close. And then if you get a Swede and a Norwegian together and make them talk to each other, they can pretty much understand each other. But the key point is making them talk to each other. If they insist that they are way different, they're going to also say that they can't understand each other. Even from a linguistic outsider perspective, it might be considered a dialect of the same language. Or if you're traveling between Greece and Turkey, and you have Turkish coffee one day, and then you go across into Greece and you have Greek coffee, and you're like, well, that was pretty much the same thing. And then, no, totally different, way different. We have little flowers on our cups, et cetera, et cetera. So we often amplify what might from the outside seem to be minor differences. And we know this too because most of most conflicts that we call ethnic conflicts are between peoples who, from an outsider perspective, are more like each other than anybody else in the world. So, the conflicts in Ireland, for example, which were very intense, but from the outside, very much the most similar people. I mean, even in the United States, the differences between what we might call different racial or ethnic groups from an outsider perspective are more American, more like each other than they are like any other group in the world. And so one of Mickey's questions was, do people use, I think if I phrase this correctly, do people use sometimes the word subculture or culture to make divisions between people? And I think that is absolutely an issue, right? People can say, oh no, we're way different, and use that to create conflict or divide people instead of creating connections. So again, these are things that sometimes from an outsider or insider perspective might be different. For me, the most important point is to realize that no culture is going to be all the same. There's always going to be variation. We should pay attention to that variation. Gonzalez also talks about how we learn culture, how culture is transmitted. The process of what we call enculturation, how we get that lens, generally happens from parents or the older generation to the younger generation. But of course, we learn a lot from our peers as well. She mentions a little bit later on a couple different ways in which societies train their young. One of them is called dependence training. On page 36, that set of child rearing practices that supports the family unit over the individual. In these societies, you know who your family is, and that is what you're supposed to be dependent on and support. And she contrasts that with independence training, the set of child rearing practices that foster a child's self-reliance, which he says found in industrial societies like our own. Now, I have to say, I don't like these terms for a couple reasons. One, there's a lot of value judgment being put on the very terms themselves. Everybody wants to be independent, not dependent. So you already have this like value judgment being put on. The other thing, having raised a couple kids who are completely dependent, in our society, if we're doing independence training, it's not working very well. We have some of the longest dependency periods that humans have ever come up with. In other societies, kids are running off on their own at like, 7, 8, 10 years old. Cyrus wouldn't even be in college, right? He'd be out there doing stuff, real stuff. So the weird, the idea that we do independence training and other societies do dependence training, to me is a little strange. I would like to reterm these as societies and groups that tend to emphasize people's social obligations above the individual obligations. And so there are certainly societies and there are certainly groups within our own society that make sure that your first obligation is to your family and to your siblings and to your parents, and then you get your stuff. But only after everybody else has been taken care of, and that that's what comes first. Versus in some societies and some groups of our own society, we teach kids that their needs come first. And that's why, in fact, they become so dependent on their parents, because we're always looking out for them and telling them that they should prioritize themselves first and that each person is out for themselves. So I guess maybe I'm being a little judgmental here myself, but the point is that, these things can be looked at in different ways. And I guess, like we hopefully know from the last part about societies being heterogeneous, even in a society that says it's doing independence training, there are going to be groups or individuals which emphasize the social. So there's a range of values here. So what I would say here is that we can get out of some of these dilemmas if we recognize that culture or society or different groups are always going to be varied and heterogeneous. That's our first point. There's always going to be variation. If we also know that culture is always changing and dynamic, Gonzalez tells us too that it's always evolving, the process of change. No enculturation is ever complete. You're always learning things from your peers and modifying things. I guess as opposed to ideas that everybody's the same or all homogeneous, as opposed to ideas that once culture is set, it never changes and is static. If we understand that cultures are always interconnected, both across a society and with their neighbors and other people, and that there's no such thing as an isolated culture or group. If you are completely isolated, you will die. That will be the end of your culture. So humans have always been in contact and trade and borrowing with other peoples. It's often very difficult to put a boundary around people, build a wall and wall them out. Those never work. And we realize that people think about their traditions and their customs, and they discuss them and they talk about them, and we use that symbolic apparatus. We do this in our own society sometimes, and other people do these things as well. They think about what they're doing. If we're able to see this about a society, if we're able to understand that people are varied, that they are dynamic, that culture is something that we create, then it helps us, I believe, with some of those dilemmas of cultural relativism. That is to say, let us say that the practice of female genital cutting is indeed a maladaptive practice, and we would want it to change. That doesn't necessarily mean that we have to impose something from the outside in order to encourage change. Because within any society, there's going to be people that might think like that as well. And they themselves are going to be thinking about these things and comparing themselves to other people. So in some ways, it's not necessarily the question of imposing your views from the outside, but encouraging the perspective of those who might be marginalized or without power in a given society. I also think this will help us avoid generalizations about independence training and dependence training, because we realize that this is a more dynamic thing than we've done. So, like I said, the concept of culture or the idea of culture can be super useful when we're using it to get away from ideas of ethnocentrism, when we're using it to contrast with old ideas about racial determinism, biological determinism, environmental determinism. But we just have to be cognizant of the ways in which culture can become misused. And so if we think of it as dynamic and heterogeneous, it helps us out with some of those classic problems. Now, the next part of the chapter is how anthropologists study culture. How do we do it, Pluto? What's the anthropological method to study culture? No, he quoted you, get in the thick of it. You just get out there and start studying things. I don't know. PowerPoint thought this was a good example of getting in the thick of it. I'm not sure why. Why did anthropologists adopt a method of going out there and getting in the thick of it? Why would anthropology think that was a good idea? Why not just study people from a distance by reading books about them? That was my other option. Yeah, Pluto. Yeah, when you're actually trying to be in it, you can better understand it. Sometimes, maybe. What else? Think about Boaz out there on Baffin Island. Why did he have to get in the thick of it to understand the Inuit? This question is too easy. There was no other way. There's no other way. He probably would have read about them if he could have, but there wasn't anything, there was no other way to do it than going there and getting into it and doing it. So you don't have to copy these down because they're in your book, different methods of field work. We have, of course, the idea of participant observation, but to that, anthropologists also do interviews, surveys, gather people's life histories, do different case studies of societies, do map out their kinship, do map making and photography, which are all things, maybe the photography was a little bit later, but were all things of what Boaz was trying to do on Baffin Island. Get in the thick of it and do this. Become as much as possible, not just a fly on the wall observer, but a participant in that society. And in the meantime, do all these things. Pluto asked if we could use this method to educate ourselves in classes. And I think that it's a good way to approach your learning in general. One of my favorite anthropologists, Tim Ingold, wrote a book called Anthropology and Education, or Anthropology as Education, which made the point that in some ways the principles of anthropology and education could be one and the same, that anthropology is at its root an education of attention, being able to pay attention to certain things in the world. So, ideally, when you're doing field work or participant observation or being in another society and trying to record all these things, it's going to reinforce or double back on the points about culture that we just talked about. So ideally, by doing that, we will figure out, we'll be able to describe that humans have patterns. They're not just running around willy-nilly as individuals, but they have to speak a language, they have to communicate with each other. We're going to learn those patterns in their own context. By doing field work, we will learn how people learn those patterns, how those patterns are passed along, how the process of enculturation works. And so we'll learn that these are socially transmitted, but also that it doesn't just work out exactly the same carbon copy into the next generation. So again, ideally, anthropology is going to document that people come in varied variation. In any society, there's going to be heterogeneity, both within a society and across different human groups. What this all adds up to, which is where we're headed for Tuesday's class, is that if you're doing good field work, the idea that people are biologically determined by their race, and that there's some sort of determination by their physical environment or physical being, it's very difficult to support when you've been with people in another society and are dependent upon them for your very survival and for learning. So in the